The sun was barely touching the horizon when Jack and Amy drove down the winding dirt road toward the hollow. The dense trees loomed on either side like silent sentinels, their dark silhouettes stretching across the narrow path. The air had that early autumn chill, sharp and penetrating, making Amy pull her jacket tighter around herself. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice tinged with excitement and just a hint of apprehension. Jack smiled, eyes scanning the shadowed woods. "It's going to be the perfect getaway. Just you, me, and the forest." At first, everything seemed serene. Leaves rustled gently in the wind, and the occasional bird call pierced the quiet. The forest looked like a postcard image of tranquility, the kind of place people came to escape their hectic lives. Yet, as their car rolled deeper into the hollow, the scenery subtly shifted. Broken branches, jagged and splintered, lined the sides of the path. Faint stains marred the dirt-dark, rusty streaks that made Jack frown. "Weird, looks like old blood," he muttered. Glancing at Amy, she shrugged nervously, not wanting to acknowledge it aloud. But the unease had already settled in her chest dot by the time they parked near a small clearing. The sun had dipped below the treetops. The forest had gone from inviting to oppressive, the shadows stretching unnaturally long, as if the trees themselves were leaning in to watch. They stepped out, crunching over the dry leaves, and the air smelled earthy and metallic, faintly sour. Amy shivered. "Do you hear that?" she asked. Jack paused, listening. There was nothing then, just barely audible, a soft snapping, like a twig breaking, but not from anywhere near them. It was deliberate, measured, and impossible to ignore. They laughed it off, nervously joking about raccoons or squirrels. But as they followed the faint path toward what the locals had ominously labeled the hollow, the forest began to reveal its darker nature. Every so often, the ground bore jagged marks, deep gouges in the soil that could not have been made by animals alone. A small paw print, or maybe something larger. Jack kicked at one mark. The soil gave way to reveal a whitish fragment, perhaps bone, partially buried beneath the leaves. His stomach sank. "Amy, I think we should be careful." Amy wanted to move on, to tell herself it was nothing, but her eyes kept flicking to the shadows between the trees. There was a subtle movement there, fleeting, almost imperceptible shapes that seemed to shift and vanish as soon as she tried to focus. Her chest tightened. The forest was no longer passive. It watched. It waited dot as they walked. The path narrowed, hemmed in by ancient oaks and gnarled roots that twisted like skeletal fingers across the forest floor. The deeper they went, the more grotesque the signs became. Broken branches jutted out at odd angles, almost like jagged bones. Dark stains marred rocks and tree trunks. Upon closer inspection, some looked eerily like splattered blood, dried for who knew how long. Jack tried to reassure Amy. "It's old. Probably from hunters," but even he couldn't ignore the rising tension. The way the wind seemed to carry whispers that were just at the edge of hearing. Then they saw the first hint of a hut. At first, it was just a dark silhouette between the trees, small and unremarkable. But as they drew closer, the air grew heavy, almost suffocating, and the ground underfoot felt spongy, soaked. A faint metallic smell prickled their noses. Amy gagged slightly. "Jack, I don't think we should..." But Jack, driven by a mixture of curiosity and adrenaline, pushed forward. The hut's door hung crooked, barely attached to its hinges. The windows were black voids, reflecting nothing, not even the dim light of the evening. As they approached, a sound caught their attention, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper carried on the wind. "You shouldn't be here." Amy froze, every hair on her arm standing on end. Jack's heart pounded, yet he forced a smile. "Probably just the wind," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Amy didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the forest behind them, where shadows seemed to twist and writhe unnaturally. Something moved. Something very close, but it never stepped fully into the open. They could sense it, a presence just beyond perception, observing, waiting. Their nerves were taut, every step echoing through the heavy silence. They reached the small clearing where the hut rested, its walls warped and weathered, stained with age and some darker substance that glimmered faintly in the fading light. There were deep gouges in the wood, claw marks, splintered and jagged, as if some animal or something else entirely had tried repeatedly to claw its way inside. A foul stench wafted from within, the smell of rot and decay mixed with something coppery and fresh. Amy gagged again, grabbing Jack's arm. "We should leave now?" Jack hesitated. His curiosity was gnawing at him, pushing him forward, despite the dread curling in his gut. He leaned closer to the doorway, peering inside. Shadows clung to the corners, thick and almost tangible. A faint scuttling sound came from the interior, like something dragging itself across the floor. Then, almost imperceptibly, the wind carried that whisper again. "You belong." To the hollow, Amy screamed, and the sound seemed to echo through the trees unnaturally. Somewhere deep in the forest, a branch snapped, not underfoot, but from above, as if something enormous had moved unseen. The leaves rustled violently, though there was no wind. The forest itself seemed to lean in, the shadows stretching, twisting, reaching. Jack grabbed Amy's hand. "Run," he whispered, but even as he said it, a sense of being watched pressed down on him, so suffocating it made his chest ache. They stumbled back toward the path, hearts hammering, but every direction seemed wrong, twisted. The forest had shifted, subtly but unmistakably. The trail they had taken was gone, replaced by gnarled roots and blood-stained dirt. Behind them, something moved, something that shouldn't exist. A fleeting shape, human in form, yet grotesquely distorted, vanished into the shadows just long enough to make them freeze in terror. Every rustle, every snap, every whisper was Jack and Amy stumbled through the forest, hearts hammering, the oppressive darkness pressing in from all sides. Every step seemed to carry them deeper into the hollow, though it was impossible to tell if they were moving forward or simply running in circles. The shadows between the trees shifted unnaturally, stretching and twisting as if the forest itself were alive, eager to swallow them whole. Amy's hands shook violently, leaving streaks of blood when she scraped her palms on the jagged roots of the trees. I can't see anything," she cried, her voice cracking with panic. Jack grabbed her arm, trying to steady both himself and her, though the metallic scent of blood clinging to the air made his stomach churn. "We have to keep moving. Don't stop. Don't..." His words cut off as something slithered past their feet. A pale, disfigured hand, or perhaps a clawed appendage, snatched at Jack's ankle before vanishing into the darkness. He stumbled, cursing, barely keeping Amy from falling with him. Eventually, they stumbled upon the hut from earlier, its warped door hanging slightly ajar. They had no choice but to enter, drawn by a mix of desperation and terror. Inside, the air was thick with decay, so heavy it made their lungs ache. The floor was slick with dried and fresh blood, and the remnants of what might have been human forms were strewn across the corners, twisted, broken, and almost unrecognizable. Amy gagged, turning her head as she tried to block the sight. Jack pressed his back against the door, trying to create a barrier between them and the ever-present darkness outside. The whispers began immediately, soft at first, almost playful, then growing sharp and demanding. "Stay forever. Belong." The words seemed to echo from the walls themselves, vibrating through the rotting floorboards and making their teeth chatter. Amy stumbled backward into a heap of bones, some still carrying remnants of flesh, the smell of copper and rot nauseating. "Oh God, Jack. This place." Her voice was barely a whisper, drowned by the sudden, loud creak of the roof above them. Then movement. In the far corner of the hut, shadows pulled together and took shape a massive figure. Human in outline but grotesque, a patchwork of pale skin and exposed muscle, stitched and fused in impossible ways. Its eyes glowed faintly, like embers, and as it stepped closer, the wooden floor groaned under its unnatural weight. Amy screamed, throwing herself toward the door, but Jack grabbed her just as the creature's clawed hand swept across the space where she had stood moments ago. The wood splintered, sending sharp shards flying, and a streak of blood coated Jack's arm where he had narrowly avoided the swipe. They tried to flee, but the hut seemed to close in on them. The walls warped, bending outward and inward in ways that made no sense. Shadows twisted across the surfaces, forming limbs that reached for them, clawed and bleeding as if the forest itself had manifested inside the building. Jack and Amy stumbled through the cramped space, stepping over torn limbs and puddles of congealed blood, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, until they couldn't distinguish between reality and hallucination. Amy tripped over something soft and squishy, letting out a shriek. She had landed on what was unmistakably a human torso, stripped of flesh in places, its skeletal ribs glistening under the faint light filtering through the cracked ceiling. Jack grabbed her arm, pulling her away, but both were coated in a mixture of blood and gore now, their hands slippery, their clothes stained. The smell was overpowering, yet it didn't trigger nausea the way they expected. It only fueled the terror, the sense that escape was impossible. The figure advanced, moving with a disturbing, jerking gait, each step leaving a smear of blood on the floor. Jack swung a broken piece of wood at it, but it passed straight through, as if he had swung at a shadow made tangible by malice. The whispers coalesced into a deafening roar. "You belong to the hollow." And then the lights in the hut went out completely, leaving only the dim glow of the figure's eyes. Jack and Amy's instincts took over. They bolted through a side door, but instead of escaping into the clearing, they found themselves on a narrow path that seemed impossibly elongated. The forest outside was no longer familiar. It twisted and convulsed like a living entity. Trees reached down with clawed branches, scraping their faces and tearing up their clothes. The ground was slick with blood, some of it fresh, some dry, all of it sticky and clinging. Each step left them slipping, sliding, scraping their knees and hands against the roots and dirt. Amy screamed as something cold and slimy wrapped around her ankle. She struggled, kicking and clawing, but the appendage was strong, pulling her toward the shadowed forest floor. Jack yanked at her, almost losing his grip, the sound of tearing flesh echoing in the dark. A wave of nausea hit him as he realized that whatever had taken her foot, or what remained, was still alive. Part of the forest now, part of the hollow. Desperation drove them onward. The whispering grew into unintelligible chants, filled with malice and hunger. The forest pulsed as if breathing, the trees writhing, forming grotesque faces that leered at them, mouths opening and closing with jagged, splintered teeth. Somewhere to their left, a human face appeared for a fraction of a second, pressed against a tree trunk, pale, eyes hollow, lips moving silently as if begging for help, but then it twisted violently and was gone. Finally, they stumbled into a small clearing. A faint moonlight filtered through, revealing the full horror of the hollow. Dozens of human corpses, partially decomposed, some stripped to the bone, others still freshly bleeding, were arranged in a grotesque circle. Their eyes seemed open, staring blankly at the fleeing couple. The forest's whispers reached a crescendo, the air vibrating with pure supernatural malice. The figure from the hut appeared at the edge of the clearing, but now it was not alone. Shadows peeled off the trees, merging into humanoid forms, each stitched from corpses, Each moving with a jerking, unnatural gait. Amy collapsed to the ground, sobbing and shaking. Jack tried to carry her, but the forest resisted, roots wrapping around his legs, tearing at his clothing and flesh. He swung wildly at the roots, drawing blood, but every movement seemed to summon more of the Hollow's creations. The stitched figures moved closer, dragging themselves with eerie persistence, their whispering voices overlapping into a hellish choir. With a final surge of adrenaline, Jack grabbed Amy's hand and pulled her toward a faintly glowing path that appeared as if conjured by desperation itself. But just as they thought they might escape, the main figure loomed directly in front of them, blocking their way. Its body was a horrific patchwork of bodies, muscles, and exposed bone, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. The air reeked of decay and iron. The forest itself seemed to lean in, and the whispers now became commands. Jack screamed as a clawed hand slashed through the air, missing him by inches but catching Amy's shoulder, tearing through her jacket and skin. Blood spattered across Jack's face, blinding him momentarily. He kicked at the creature with all his strength, but it did not recoil. Its head tilted unnaturally, teeth bared in a frozen grin, and the forest around them seemed to close in. The last thing they saw before everything went black was the hollow itself, alive and pulsing, blood seeping from the ground, twisting roots rising to meet them, stitched figures advancing, whispers screaming, "You belong forever." The night swallowed them completely. The forest watched silently, patient and eternal, already hungry for its next visitors. The hollow had claimed them, just as it had countless others, leaving nothing but twisted shadows and blood-soaked soil behind.
Please like and subscribe channel Fear Frequency for more horror stories. Thank you.